And I see that we've got a quorum. So it's 1:31. Let's get started. I'd like to call to order the July 14th, 2021 Stanislaus and Tuolumne Rivers Groundwater Basin Association Technical Advisory Committee meeting. So welcome everybody. The member agencies on the phone. I see we have Mike Pitcock from City of Waterford, Eric Thorber, myself, obviously from Oakdale Irrigation District, Chad Tinkin from Modesto Irrigation District, and Walt Ward from Stanislaus County. Did I miss anybody on the phone from the member agencies? Okay, well, with that, I'm sure we'll have a couple more join on here in a little bit, but let's get rolling. So right to item number 2, business from the public. So at this time, interested persons are welcome to introduce any topic within the agency's jurisdiction. Matters presented under this heading may be discussed, but no action will be taken by the agency at this meeting. So let's open it up to the public. I'm not seeing any hands up. I'm not hearing anything. Okay, so hearing none, we'll move on to item 3. This is approval of the 6/23/21 Special Technical Advisory Committee meeting minutes. So assuming everybody has had a chance to review those minutes, I'll entertain a motion.
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Chad.
This is Walt, I second.
Thanks, Walt. Are there any comments or questions from the member agencies? Okay, and we'll open it up. Hearing none, we'll open it up to the public for comments, questions from the public on the minutes. Okay, with no further comments and hearing nothing from the public here, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? All right, motion passes unanimously. Item number 4. So the topic here is sustainable management criteria and groundwater dependent ecosystems, and that is TAC groundwater. So I think that's you, Phyllis.
It is. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the TAC meeting today. I am going to share my screen, and the first thing I'm going to do is get it readable for us. And we will be talking today about 2 topics, some of which is a bit of a review. We're going to dive into the sustainable management criteria for interconnected surface water and chronic lowering of water levels. And let me get the thing set up here. Let's view our slideshow. I have lost that. Let me see if I can just do this. Oops. Sorry, we are having a little technical difficulty. Okay, here we go. All right. The first topic that we're going to talk about today is interconnected surface water. And it will be a bit of a review, but we're also going to incorporate a preliminary analysis that's been done for groundwater dependent ecosystems. So that's the little bit of a new piece associated with today's presentation. After we talk about interconnected surface water, we're going to move to chronic lowering of water levels with a quick review. And for both of these sustainability indicators, I'm going to review our recommended approach for the undesirable results definition and the preliminary definition of a minimum threshold. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we would like for the TAC to give the technical team an okay to move forward with these definitions and incorporate those into the remaining portions of our GSP analysis. So diving in first to interconnected surface water, I'd like to review this little cartoon diagram that's at the top that has 3 diagrams with respect to groundwater and surface water connection. So on the left diagram, we've got that labeled gaining stream, and that's a situation where we see the water table, which is shown by the groundwater system in the darker blue on that block diagram, and the light blue surface water in the river are connected, with the water table being a little bit higher than the stage in that first diagram. And as a result of that hydraulic gradient, we would see groundwater contributing to the flow in the river. With respect to the center diagram and a losing stream condition, we still have that interconnection between the two systems, but the water table in this one is a little bit lower than the stage in the river. And as a result of that, we have a hydraulic gradient that is mostly groundwater recharge. So we refer to that as a losing stream. And then that connection can be actually broken, and the two systems can be disconnected if water tables continue to decline further, such that the saturated zone is not intercepting the base of the channel. And the reason that I thought it was helpful to review these three diagrams is to point out that it's almost never one or the other. In particular, for the interconnected surface water that we have been analyzing in the Modesto subbasin, we go back and forth, sometimes monthly, sometimes on a seasonal basis, and sometimes on an annual hydrologic basis between gaining, losing, depending on the fluctuations of surface water and groundwater systems at and beneath the river. During our historical water budget, we use the integrated surface water groundwater model, which looks at these surface water features and its connection with groundwater. We noted that during that 25-year period, all three of our river boundaries were not only connected, but they had a net gaining system, such that the Tuolumne, the San Joaquin, and the Stanislaus rivers, even though they might go back and forth from gaining under certain conditions and losing under certain conditions, you add all of those numbers together, it results in a net gaining stream. But we also were changing land use during that time period. And as a result of that, those conditions were changing slightly over time. And by the time we project those current conditions into the future, we see from our integrated surface water groundwater modeling that the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus would transition to a net losing stream, although remain connected to the groundwater system. So we don't have the situation where we're concerned that the third circumstance is going to occur in our future analysis, but that we would just be losing more often than gaining, and certainly changing it from current conditions now. I'll just point out the net losing stream actually benefits groundwater, as you can imagine, because it adds water as recharge to the groundwater system. The problem, of course, is that if that happens too often and at too large of a quantity, you can impact surface water rights in the river, and certainly surface water beneficial uses, not only by those rights holders, but also the ecosystems that rely on the surface water within the channel for its livelihood. And of course, we're putting together projects and operational measures in place so that we can minimize any stream flow depletion, but we also need to think about that with respect to our sustainable management criteria. And in evaluating the sustainable management criteria for interconnected surface water, the Department of Water Resources Best Management Practices provides us with a list of technical considerations that we need to review when selecting a minimum threshold for this indicator. And we've talked about most of the other ones in previous presentations, so I'm not going to review those now. But the one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the final one that is highlighted there, impacts on groundwater dependent ecosystems. So I wanted to touch on that a bit as we go forward with our interconnected surface water sustainable management criteria. The first thing to say about the potential GDEs within the subbasin is that we got the maps a little late. So they were not available to us during the project scoping and grant contracting. That had all been completed by the time we got those maps. And the GSAs determined that if we could incorporate a preliminary assessment that we needed with respect to groundwater management into this portion of the GDE, that they would commission a more detailed study of the GDEs going forward from those who were qualified to evaluate the vegetative communities and ecosystems a little bit more than the hydrogeologists. And so as a result of that, we probably will move forward in the GSP identifying GDEs as a data gap. But we did want to provide at least a preliminary assessment of the GDEs in order to assist us with interconnected surface water. So just a little bit more about this. The regulations require identification of GDEs using the best available data. And in particular, note that there might be available data from the department. And of course, there was in April 2018, the Department of Water Resources, in conjunction with mapping done by the Nature Conservancy, provided potential GDEs data set to us. That was in April 2018, and that really is the best available information that we have for the Modesto subbasin. So we have begun with that process of evaluating those that data set. There's about 1,800 separate polygons provided to us in Geographic Information System, GIS format for the basin. And we really needed a reasonable approach rather than going through, 1, 2, 3, up to 1,800 separate areas to do a preliminary assessment on a sub-basin basis to support the GSP and to recommend the elimination of polygons that were clearly unlikely to be GDEs now to the extent that we can. And then again, conducting a more technically credible study after January 2022. So just taking a step back and asking ourselves what a GDE is to remind ourselves, get us all on the same page, that groundwater dependent ecosystems are plant and animal communities that rely either solely or partially on groundwater for their water supply. STRGBA further provides some information about GDEs and refers to them as ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers, such as springs or wetlands, or groundwater occurring near the ground surface. In other words, a water table that's significantly shallow to be able to support perhaps plant roots in particular for groundwater dependent ecosystems. STRGBA includes specific requirements for GSAs to identify GDEs in their subbasin and to consider these impacts to GDEs from their groundwater management decisions that's being made in association with the GSP. So we developed internal to this GSP a methodology for a preliminary assessment, and it's outlined here that we would consider the Nature Conservancy NCAG polygons. I'm calling those natural communities commonly associated with groundwater NCAG in this presentation, as potential GDEs for the subbasin. So we start there with those 1,800 polygons and then compare those polygons to what we know about depth to water under various hydrologic conditions, two of which I'm going to be looking at today: a wet period, which was the wettest time and the highest water levels that we have during our 25-year study period for the historical water budgets, and that was spring 1998. And then the very dry conditions for the fall of 2015 are also evaluated. And rather than use contours based on observed data within the subbasin, which are just fine for a variety of groundwater condition analysis, we wanted something more robust. There are imperfect data for looking at this very complex and dynamic interconnected surface water groundwater system. And most wells are either not close enough to the river or are screened inappropriately to be able to evaluate whether or not you would expect to see gaining or losing reaches. Further, it's awfully difficult to actually quantify the volumes associated with that just based on well data alone. So we were lucky enough here to have already prepared for the GSP, the Integrated Surface Water Groundwater Model, using C2V-SIM, and the TM that we have added to that C2V-SIM stands for Turlock Modesto. As many of you already know, we are we have incorporated the C2V-SIM regional model into a local model with detailed water budget information from the Turlock and the Modesto subbasins. Because they are adjacent and contiguous subbasins, one model over both subbasins gives us a lot of information about how to evaluate groundwater and surface water conditions throughout that region. And that integrates, that model integrates the Modesto subbasin surface water features into it. So those contours are going to be, even though they're modeled contours, they're calibrated to real world conditions, and they are also much more rigorous with respect to details at the river boundaries and beneath the rivers, and provide a much better way of assessing depth to water than we could with our imperfect data. So with that information we put together and assessed where the NCAG polygons are mapped that occur in areas where depth to water exceeds 30 feet, which is generally accepted as a reasonable maximum rooting depth in incorporation with TNC best management practices. If groundwater is deeper than 30 feet from the surface, especially during high water level periods, then the GDEs are less likely, the polygons that are provided in the NCAG data set are less likely to be GDEs. So let's start from the beginning. These are all of the potential GDEs in the Modesto subbasin in the NCAG data set. Again, about 1,800 polygons, 768 of which are wetland areas, 1,027 vegetative areas. We all know that vegetation presence, and I want to emphasize also that TNC recognizes also that the vegetation presence doesn't necessarily indicate a GDE. They did the mapping at a relatively high level across the entire state and provide that information for additional detailed assessment by the subbasins and by the GSAs. And so to begin sort of thinking through whether or not the polygons are GDEs, our first shot is to take a look at high water levels during the period. And that is time period when depth to water was less than 30 feet during spring of 1998. So what you see indicated in the map by the purple shading are areas where shallow groundwater occurs within the subbasin, such that the depth to water is less than 30 feet in the vicinity of each of these polygons that we evaluate. And so, I think the first thing you can see is that there's a rather wide swath of the subbasin in the west that is shaded purple and is associated with shallow groundwater in that area. For a variety of reasons. As everyone knows, there's a surface water supply provided to this area for agricultural operations and for some urban application as well. And in addition, this is the downgrading extent of the subbasin. So all of the groundwater that enters into the subbasin essentially flows toward this area. And then this is the sort of discharge area along the San Joaquin River for the entire subbasin. So recognizing that these purple areas have groundwater elevations that are within 30 feet of the surface, they are not, polygons in these areas are not removed from the data set because they could potentially be supported as GDEs. Polygons outside of these areas, however, are not likely supported by the groundwater system, and as a result of that, are removed. And this is the map that removes the polygons that are outside of the depth to water of 30 feet. You might recall that there were a lot of dots of polygons in this area and in this area that are just simply not likely GDEs based on what we know about groundwater depths in those areas. So it brings the 1,800 polygons down to about 1,500 polygons that we need to continue to assess for groundwater management. It's about a 15% decrease from the original NCAG data set. You can see that the polygons that remain, again, are in the western portion of the subbasin associated with the National Wildlife Refuge along the San Joaquin River. and then additional polygons all along the river boundaries, the San Joaquin, the Stanislaus, and the Tuolumne, and also the internal drainage along Dry Creek. So those polygons, after the first assessment of spring 1998, are retained in the data set for additional study. Then we looked at a dry period, fall 2015. The depth to water during that time period is much less. You can see on the western portion of the subbasin that the purple shaded area is quite a bit smaller. There's still shallow water in the area, of course, and especially covering all of the National Wildlife Refuge that occurs there along the San Joaquin River. And all of the areas along the river remain with a groundwater table of 30 feet or less below the surface. This is consistent with the interconnected surface water results that we've been providing information on in these meetings, that the rivers are connected and remain connected to the groundwater system, even through the drought of record that we saw in the very dry conditions of fall 2015. So the areas of purple, of course, may be capable of supporting GDEs going forward, but the other areas, especially along Dry Creek, which had a depth of to groundwater of 30 feet during the spring 1998 conditions, certainly has lost that connection with the groundwater system during dry conditions, especially during fall 2015. So recognizing that we want to assess what's going on in 2015 conditions and then make sure that we don't make things worse with our groundwater management, we've removed those other GDEs along the potential GDEs along Dry Creek and are left with about 1,300 polygons retained in the NCAG data set for the Modesto subbasin moving forward. It's about a 28% overall of a decrease in the total number of polygons that we have on this map compared to our initial map. We noted that most of the polygons that were mapped along the upper reaches of Dry Creek were actually quite, it had a depth to water very close to 30 feet initially, and even in the wet periods. And so by the time we got to the dry periods, we had fallen below that preliminary assessment of a 30-foot depth to water. So they've been removed on this map. But I do want to just note that we aren't completely removing them from study. The county is embarking on a flood management project along Dry Creek, and there will be CEQA associated with this, this issue. We see this as a potential flood control and recharge combination project for our GSP. So we're looking at this very carefully and following what the county is doing. And there will eventually be CEQA if there's a project for additional recharge on this. So that process will support additional analysis, as will the identification of potential GDEs as a data gap. So this is the map that we're moving forward with respect to paying close attention with respect to groundwater management. Does anybody have any questions on the preliminary GDE analysis that we talked about before we move on?
Yeah, so let's open up to member agencies first for questions. Any questions from the member agencies? Okay, hearing none, let's move to the public. Hillary, you've got your hand up.
Hey, Eric, thank you.
You're welcome.
So looking at these maps, we've looked at maps similar to this in other basins. And one of the things that this approach neglects to really take into consideration is that many of these areas are actually served by either surface water or groundwater or our tailwater return systems. So I just want to caution that, I understand the time crunch of moving forward, but we could be identifying things that are not really GDEs in this approach.
It's a very good comment. Thank you, Hillary. I agree with you. And that's why we are continuing to call these potential GDEs to move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My other concern would be moving forward with this approach is the landowners. You know, they're going to see this map if they haven't already been involved in this process, and they're going to see that their land is actually designated as a GDE. And if it's not what they would consider a GDE, that's going to give them potential concern.
Yes, I agree. And I know that you and I have talked about the issues of showing maps at public meetings and people going, hey, that's my property. I was hoping at this scale that we weren't really picking on anyone in particular. Again, these are potential GDEs. They are public data. They're provided by the Department of Water Resources and TNC, and they are used in every subbasin, as you know, to support the GSP process. So we are obligated by the GSP regulations to identify them and also to consider them in the GSP. And so we really need to do that. And again, I hope that everyone will recognize, and I appreciate your highlighting it, that these are potential and not final groundwater dependent ecosystems. The only thing that I can say about the ones that are not along the drainage ways, which most of them are in this subbasin, we've essentially removed all of the ones that were not as potential GDEs, except for those that are already on National Wildlife Refuge lands in the western portion of the basin. There are just a few additional very small dots, but most of the rest of them are along the drainages of the basin. Any other questions before we move on?
I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Eric, it's not a question, but it's a comment as well. The way I've seen other GSPs approach this is all of these potential GDEs are identified and stay on the table until they're eliminated by a set of criteria that we develop, such as the 30-foot depth of water that Phyllis mentioned, or the particular land use, and there's many other screening criteria. So the concept is they all are considered viable until they are eliminated. So it's kind of a process of elimination to back into a final map. And then Phyllis, I think what we've been doing down in Turlock has been using some ground truthing and some field work where vegetation is then mapped and some other factors to further refine, you know, what is truly a GDE, because that's really what we want to get to, is where are the bona fide GDEs, and then what are the mechanisms that we can put in place to protect them.
Absolutely. Excellent summary, Walt. That's exactly where we are. We are going through the process of elimination and ground truthing. There will be no additional ground truthing of the GDEs as associated from the technical team for this GSP. But if there are certain areas along the drainages or in those few dots that are around Mays Boulevard, if there is additional information that others would like to provide. I know the GSAs have member agencies whose areas cover these maps, and these maps have been provided back to the GSAs. And so if there's any information that others would like to provide to the technical team to justify and show the technical rationale for elimination of additional GDEs, would be glad to incorporate it. But the technical team really was asked by the GSAs to just do this preliminary analysis and then move forward with what we had, recognizing that there would be additional analysis in the future.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks, Walt. We've got one more question, one more hand raised. Ali Stevens, you got the floor.
Yeah, Walt's comment just brought up a question, and I think Phyllis answered it. So you will accept information submitted by a private party with regard to potential GDEs, like on a landowner's property, or does it need to be submitted by a member agency? Are there any kind of requirements on who can make that request or request that they be eliminated?
Allie, if you have information and you'd like to go through the whatever, either the member agency or the GSA, because we're sort of everybody is everybody here, that would be great. The technical team will need the technical rationale behind it. We will need a little bit more than just, hi, here's a polygon and it's not a GDE. But if there is information that you would like to submit, we'll be happy to take it on. We just aren't going to do the ground truthing ourselves during this GSP process.
Okay, is there a time period within which that would need to be submitted so that it potentially makes it into the GSP, or?
Excellent question. I haven't exactly thought that through yet, but anytime, at least any time in the next month or so, it would be preferable, because that's when we're going to be writing everything up. But to be perfectly frank with you, the final bite at the apple will be before the final GSP is submitted to the GSAs for adoption. So there's always an opportunity for some last minute adjustments.
Okay, like in comments or something on the draft GSP?
That would be fabulous.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions currently, so you can move on.
I sure will. Thanks very much. I appreciate you staying engaged with us, stakeholders. This is a table that you saw last time. This is the results of the sustainable yield modeling analysis. And we had a whole presentation on that last time. Woodard and Curran did a fabulous job, and I'm not going to reinvent the wheel talking about the sustainable yield criteria, but I am going to talk a little bit about how we're using the sustainable yield modeling scenario to confirm that our approach for sustainable management criteria for this indicator still seems reasonable to us. So essentially, our sustainable yield scenario indicated that future stream flow depletions could be partially offset. Those are those projected future baseline projection of depletions that we were talking about previously, that those could be partially offset if water levels are managed at or above the 2015 water levels. And what this table does is provide detailed information on interconnected the surface water modeling for the Tuolumne River, the San Joaquin River, the Stanislaus River, and then the top row there is the sum of those impacts for each of the three rivers for a sort of total subbasin stream flow depletion. When you see a negative number on this table, it means that it is a primarily gaining or a net gaining stream. In other words, you have to think about these positive and negative numbers from the perspective of the groundwater. So just pretend you're the groundwater system, and if it's a negative 60,000 acre feet, which is what it was in the historical period, then the groundwater system is giving up 60,000 acre feet a year to the river systems. So if that makes sense, then that's gaining surface water and losing groundwater. So with respect to the historical conditions, we can see from those negative numbers that all of our river systems during the historical period were net gaining rivers. Again, doesn't mean that they didn't lose during some periods and gain during others, but a net gaining river over that 25-year study period. The projections for baseline over the 50-year period, you can see that many of those negative numbers turn positive. What that means is that there's now more recharge to groundwater than there is contribution from groundwater to the river.
Phyllis.
Yes. I'm sorry, did someone?
Yeah, my internet connection just went unstable, but you're back.
Oh, okay, good, thanks. So that was the baseline conditions. And then in the 2015, which was the dry conditions, now this is 2015 with respect to the river systems as modeled with the integrated surface water groundwater model. It's going to be different than that last column I'm going to talk about in just a second. But during the 2015 dry condition, you can see that we still maintained sort of negative numbers, and overall contribution from the groundwater to the surface water system. The Stanislaw became a little bit more net losing than net gaining, but overall maintaining that net gaining approach even during the drought of record, so to speak. But what we would like to do is to have a way of mitigating such that we don't make any of the conditions worse. And certainly 2015 was just one time period, and we would like to be able to have improved conditions from just that one time period if possible. And so by keeping water levels at 2015 levels, and when I say at or above, that is considering sort of the 2015 levels as a floor, but there might be short periods where drought would bring that below 2015, but not very far, and then it would be recovering. So using those 2015 water levels as a potential minimum threshold, which is essentially what the sustainable yield modeling is doing here, then we can see that we can improve on most of the conditions that we saw in 2015 and overall maintain a net gaining river system associated with the subbasin. So that is part of the reason. One of the things that Sigma says is that conditions that occurred as of January 1st, 2015, it's not the GSA's mandate or responsibility to either correct or improve on those, but we don't want to make it worse. And so that's what we are looking with respect to making sure that we don't make conditions worse for either our surface water rights holders who manage these rivers, and recognizing that they are an important water supply for the subbasin as well, and also supporting the ecosystems. I put a note at the bottom of this slide that I didn't have added in the one that was posted on the website. So I want to just take a second to highlight that. There were some questions in previous meetings about, well, why is it that you're trying to keep conditions at 2015? 2015 was the drought of record. And the answer is we're not, by setting our minimum thresholds at 2015 water levels, we're not keeping and managing conditions at that drought of record level. That represents a floor, if you can think about it in that respect, that the minimum threshold of 2015 water levels is really the floor. Water levels are going to fluctuate above that and will be higher during wet periods. So the fluctuations will still occur between the minimum threshold and the wet periods. So we just want to make sure. I think that there was a misunderstanding from a question that we had previously that the 2015 water levels, does that mean that you're going to manage 2015 levels going forward forever? And the answer is that you have to think of that as a floor, and it's a floor really that we've had already and that we've already seen in the subbasin, and again wanting to make sure that we don't worsen conditions with our management actions. And moving on, thinking about setting sustainable management criteria, there's a metric required for interconnected surface water that is requires that you use a rate or a volume of stream flow depletion as the metric. That's illustrated on that DWR diagram from the best management practices that's on the left there, whereby you're setting a volume or a rate that you want to be able to stay below so that you can manage your stream flow depletion going forward. Our adjacent subbasins have used groundwater levels as a proxy for interconnected surface water. We wanted to consider doing that as well because that makes for something that is a little bit more manageable with respect to monitoring going forward. So our approach for using water levels as a proxy for the depletion volume of rate consists of sort of these following considerations. So the first thing we need to think about is there a groundwater elevation correlation between monitoring sites and between water levels compared to a volume or a rate of streamflow depletion? We need to be able to demonstrate that to be able to justify the proxy. And we believe that the sustainable yield modeling that we've conducted provides that rate and volume of what we are trying to achieve and stay within the ranges of what we have seen from our sustainable yield modeling. So that second bullet suggests that we can correlate the 2015 water levels along the rivers to the net streamflow depletion. And that was the negative 14,000 acre foot a year is the summary from the table that we just looked at with respect to the overall three systems together, but we can look at it on a river by river basis when we get into the sustainable management criteria, and that can be used to develop the metric. In other words, gives us an understanding of how we can relate water levels back to the volume or rate of streamflow depletion. So we believe that using a minimum threshold of 2015 water levels can correlate to this rate and volume that we have analyzed through the integrated surface water groundwater modeling. And we also think it's appropriate. Not only does it not make things worse, but it's better than what we would see for the projected future baseline or even for the 2015 flow conditions for most of the rivers. So that is the process of sort of thinking through how the metric and the water levels might relate to one another with respect to this indicator. And based on everything that you've heard essentially today, and you've seen this slide before, this is what the technical team is recommending with respect to the GSA's approval process, just to allow us to get this into the draft GSP and to begin developing the measurable objectives and the minimum thresholds associated with this approach so that we can provide the monitoring network details back to everyone for their consideration. So the undesirable result shown here is rather straightforward and quite simple. Significant and unreasonable adverse impacts on the beneficial users and the uses of surface water caused by groundwater extraction. So the beneficial uses of surface water would include both surface water rights holders, those that manage the rivers, as well as the ecosystems that rely on the surface water supply. And the reason for adding groundwater extraction is that we can think of a variety of other things that might result in streamflow depletion, but we are specifically looking at the impacts that would occur from lowered water levels near and beneath the rivers as a result of groundwater extraction within the subbasin. So we need to define a minimum threshold using that idea of water levels as a proxy for the rate or volume of streamflow depletion. We're suggesting that for the Tuolumne, San Joaquin, and Stanislaus rivers, the MT will be expressed as the low groundwater elevations observed in fall 2015 at representative monitoring wells along the river boundaries. There is a requirement in the GSP regulations to determine when and where exceedances of this MT might actually represent an undesirable result. And it's actually a very helpful thing, I think, for the GSAs to do that, because this provides an opportunity to manage to the levels that you're trying to manage to, rather than worrying about one well showing some pumping water level or some other water level that's not indicative of the entire surface of the 2015 levels. So as a result of that, the undesirable result will be evidenced by an exceedance of an MT at a designated percentage of the representative monitoring locations for a designated number of consecutive semi-annual monitoring events along the river. And so that when and where portion has not yet been determined, but that's what we'd like to be able to move forward with. And so if we have an okay from the GSAs, then we can begin to take the fall 2015 water levels and establish these MTs, put together a monitoring network that makes sense along the river boundaries, and determine what makes sense with respect to the percentages of locations and the number of consecutive semi-annual monitoring events along the river. So that's the portion of the presentation for interconnected surface water. And maybe I'll just stop here for a second in case there are any additional questions
I think
people might have.
Yeah, that's a good point to stop. This is going to be item 5, I should note, as an action item at the meeting that will follow this, the regular, or the regular STRGBA GSA meeting. So I think it's good to have some discussion about this. From my perspective, the when and where, like you said, is going to be the most important part. We still have some work to do, but this is a good framework to at least establish now and get ourselves to the point where we can move forward with that discussion. So with that, are there any comments or questions from the member agencies?
The only comment I would make, Eric, is this is, as proposed, is very similar to what we're doing in the Turlock Basin.
That's a good point. Thanks, Walt. Any other comments, questions from the member agencies? Okay, hearing none, seeing none. Let's open it up to the public. I've got one hand up. Terpstra?
Oh, sorry, I don't know why it came up like that. This is Stacy Henderson. How are you?
Hi, Stacy.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I just had a quick question. Does the undesirable result standard have to be the same throughout the entire subbasin? And as I'm sure you probably can expect from my previous comments, because of my thoughts are, because of the variation in the condition throughout the basin, I'm hopeful that we will be able to set the undesirable result standard that when and where differently, because of the way in which, like, for example, over on the west side where MID's district is, and I'm sure it's the same in OID's district, following the drought, the groundwater levels rebounded quite significantly, quite quickly, whereas on the east side, that obviously didn't happen. And so I'm just looking for whether or not we're going to be able to set the undesirable result standard in a manner that makes sense based on those varying conditions.
So the definition for undesirable results has to be exactly the same for the entire subbasin, but the details that you're talking about with respect to setting the sort of where and when with respect to the sustainable management criteria, that can differ by management area. And so we don't quite have the monitoring network together yet for the rivers. I can tell you already, we're not going to be perfect on that monitoring network because we don't have perfect wells located within the river boundaries, but we are going to put that together and come up with what we think is a reasonable way to move it forward. And then you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on that, Stacy. I will just caution you that there are a couple of additional considerations, and I mentioned some of them today. One is the western areas have ecosystems that rely on not only surface water, but also higher groundwater levels. And we also need to think about stream flow depletions within the three river boundaries. So those are considerations that we want to take into the thought process for each one of the sort of where and when. Does that answer your question or make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Any other questions, Eric?
Not seeing any hands up yet. I'll give it a minute here.
Sure.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else eager to
Okay.
step forward, so let's keep moving if you don't mind.
Yeah, that'd be great. So moving now to chronic lowering of water levels. This is mostly a review. This is a shorter presentation than the other one. So thank you for hanging in there, everyone. I see that we're coming up on an hour. For the chronic lowering of water levels, I want to quickly review the analysis that we put together previously and then stop at where we are with respect to the approach for undesirable result and minimum thresholds. You might recall that one of the things that we had looked at were adverse impacts to water supply wells, and we used the recent drought as an opportunity for us to sort of test out what problems water suppliers had with respect to what was pretty much the then historic low water level in the subbasin. We had about 159 domestic well failures, as reported to Stanislaus County, who did an excellent job in documenting all of this information, assisting well owners with a variety of mitigation measures and as associated with their dry well program. This accounted for help to those domestic well owners from about 2014 through 2016. Through about 2017. There were most of those problem wells, as documented by the county, suggested that these wells were either old or shallow, less than 100 feet deep, and in some cases more than 50 years old. So SGMA doesn't require that we protect every single old or shallow well, but we certainly want to consider the domestic well situation when we put together our minimum thresholds for the subbasin. We had adverse impacts to other water supply wells during this time period as well. The city of Waterford lost a key public water supply well as a result of collapsed casing due to lowering of water levels. OID had difficulty managing their agricultural water supply wells, which they rely on to maintain the flow in their canals with their surface water deliveries. So it wasn't as if there were no problems associated with the low water levels during the drought of record. Much of these issues have been mitigated to date, and I'll start by just taking a look at domestic wells first. So since 2015, there have been more than 100 domestic wells drilled in the subbasin. Those are shown by the dots on the map. The dots on the map, rather than indicate depth, actually indicate the amount of the water column within the well. So what we were trying to do is to be a little more precise than just looking at a well depth, but just looking at the amount of water availability within the well so that we could estimate whether or not a 10-foot drop would be vulnerable, a 20-foot drop, et cetera. The number of domestic wells that have been drilled since 2015 are not easy to match up with the failed wells on a kind of one-on-one basis. There are imprecise well location information and a little bit sort of difficulty, especially with the historical wells. But for the most part, it does appear to us from looking at those numbers that there are significant numbers and in the same locations as where we had the failed wells. We do recognize, however, that there are two areas that are a little more susceptible to vulnerability in the future if water levels decline, and those are shown by those sort of generalized red oval areas on this map. So we wanted to pay particular attention to what water levels were doing in those areas and consider that process when we suggested what we would want to see for sustainable management criteria. And so I'll just, we've talked about this before, so I'll just mention that last bullet there. These hydrographs indicate that current water levels in those two areas have been relatively stable since the 2015 levels have occurred. So we haven't seen additional declines in those areas. So we're still very close to where we were with those near historic lows in those two areas of vulnerability. So just to sort of summarize some of the information, we did have adverse impacts to the water supply wells, as we have just mentioned with respect to the Waterford OID and the domestic wells. And then also the City of Modesto and some other member agencies also predict that there might be problems if we don't arrest declines in the subbasin. If water levels continue to decline significantly, they had vulnerable wells as well. Most of the failed domestic wells appear to have been replaced or deepened, but there are some local areas, as we just suggested, that remain vulnerable if water levels are allowed to decline. And the key that we were kind of focused on was about 50 foot of decline would potentially impact additional wells. The GSP projects that we're putting together are going to increase a reliable supply for the public water suppliers. Two of the projects in particular are making sure that there's provision of surface water for the public water suppliers. The City of Modesto already has an agreement in place with Modesto Irrigation District, so they're looking to make sure that they're optimizing the available water that could be provided to the city. And there's a project that we are investigating the engineering aspects of right now for provision of water to the City of Waterford, who also had a water supply well issue during the drought. So what we have concluded from the technical team's perspective is that maintaining water levels at or above these recent historic low levels would sufficiently protect current water supply wells and could avoid undesirable results. And with that in mind, I will move to the last slide, which is one that you've also seen before. This is the technical team's recommendation for a definition for undesirable result and a setting of minimum thresholds. And the undesirable result definition is a little long. It was modified based on some comments we had from stakeholders, so thanks very much for participating in that. The undesirable result that we have recommended reads significant and unreasonable groundwater level declines, either due to multi-year droughts or due to chronic declines where groundwater is the sole supply, such that water supply wells are adversely impacted in a manner that cannot be readily managed or mitigated. The managed or mitigated part comes from comments from our member agencies who said, you know, we have several backup wells, we have several wells that we redistribute our pumping among those wells from time to time, making decisions based on not only service to our customers, but also water quality issues, et cetera. And so it's not a deal breaker if one of our shallow wells becomes unusable for a short period of time. So that's what those are examples of what we from the technical team mean by this readily managed or mitigated going forward. The minimum threshold definition is shown there in the darker gray and reads: the minimum threshold will be expressed as the historic low groundwater elevation observed or estimated from water year 1991 through water year 2020 at each representative monitoring location based on available data. So let's unpack that for a bit. That's a little bit of a lot of details there. So one of the things that I mentioned as we went through the details just now is that we don't see an impact from the additional lowering of water levels in some areas by just a small amount. We don't see anything that would raise us to be concerned about undesirable results with respect to our lowering of water levels in areas where we have our water supply wells. And as such, we think that we could go a little lower than just the 2015 levels in the areas where water levels have declined a bit. They really are quite close. So that is the reason for setting the minimum threshold at the historic low groundwater elevation for chronic lowering of water levels. The reason that I put a time frame on there is because we need some sort of guidance with respect to looking at available data and determining the same historic low for all of the wells that we put together in the monitoring network and we haven't quite finished water year 2021 yet. So the data that we have goes through water year 2020. But that gives us a very long period. It's an entire 25-year period of the historical study period, as well as sort of bringing us up to current conditions. And then similar to what we talked about before, this is again the when and where aspect of the minimum threshold and the undesirable result. That's that second paragraph in the dark gray that begins that the undesirable result will be evidenced by an exceedance of a minimum threshold in the designated percentage of representative monitoring wells for a number of consecutive semi-annual monitoring events in each management area. So unlike the rivers, we added in each management area, because now we're talking about monitoring networks within the management area, not just along the rivers. And the when and where aspects are similar to what we had talked about with respect to the interconnected surface water. So those will be put together again per management area. So with respect to Stacy's previous question, this would be a little bit more conducive to setting different sustainable management criteria in different areas of the subbasin. And then the percentage and number of monitoring events are to be based on the final networks. You really need something in front of you to be able to say, when you start talking about, well, percentage of wells, it's like, well, how many wells are in the network? And so that's why we're trying to kind of do everything all at once, to get the network together, to pull the historical information for water levels together, so that we can show the TAC, the GSAs, and the stakeholders what this really means and how it would be applied. So this is the last slide for the chronicling of water level discussion, and it is what we are asking the GSAs to give us an okay on with respect to putting this in the draft GSP and moving forward with those details for the monitoring network. So I'll stop here again and see if there are any final questions on this part of the presentation.
Thanks, Phyllis. This is also going to be an action item. It's action item number 4 at the GSA meeting that will be following this meeting. Thanks for this presentation, Phyllis. I think you did a great job. This is, from my opinion, definitely one of the sticking points, and I think it's nice that we have enough time to talk about it. So I think we're going to have some questions on it. From OID's perspective, obviously water levels having the influence of the east, we've seen OID's water levels in OID's management area, in the OID service area management area, decline, even though OID is known to be a net positive contributor. So this is definitely I think the most important part and aspect of this is going to be, that percentage of wells, the number of consecutive events, and the monitoring network as a whole, just to understand how OID is affected by that and how it kind of portrays OID's management area and what management actions need to occur in OID as a result. So it's something we'll obviously be taking into careful consideration. But I think this is a good starting point, again, framework to move forward with those discussions. So we look forward to that. We obviously don't want to be, right out of the gate starting in a probationary status. So as a basin, as a whole. So we need to just be careful from that respect, how that kind of plays out with those 3 things. So I'll open it up to comments, questions from the member agencies.
So Phyllis, this is Mike with the City of Waterford. So if I understand you correctly, the use of the 1991 through 2020 data would result in generally the water level being lower than 2015?
Yes. In your area, it's not very much, but it is a little bit. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else from the member agencies? Okay, we'll open it up to the public. Hillary, I see you have your hand up.
Eric, this is not directly related to this, but
is related to kind of historical conditions and the adverse effects of the last drought that we're seeing. I'm curious what has been going on this year with the severe drought conditions we've been under. Are there reports of domestic wells going dry? Are there issues with ag wells? Just looking forward to what kind of management projects are going to be needed, or management actions are going to be needed in projects. And then also thinking about what you said about, are we going to start off in a probationary period because of the drought that we're experiencing this year?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking that question. I knew that if I showed something that said it was going to cut it off at 2020, everybody would go, what about this year? And it's a good question. We can't keep chasing our tails, but it's a good question to consider. But let me try for your two questions. So reports of domestic well issues, we actually have had one. It's not in my two areas of vulnerability, unfortunately. It's just like, okay, I just didn't expect that. It's a well that is in the eastern portion of the city of Modesto. It actually of the Modesto Irrigation District. It's actually an eastern portion there, and that well is very shallow. That well is only 72 feet deep, and it's awfully hard to continue to try to protect shallow wells. So we are continuing to examine any additional reports that occur, and we are continuing to look at water level depths in certain areas to see if certain things can be affected. But there's only been one since the drought of record occurred. And so one well is important, but at least it's encouraging that it's not multiple wells. So that's the report on the first part of your question. With respect to being in probation, so STRGBA allows for a 20-year implementation period. And while we certainly don't want to see any impacts to wells with the continuing drought, we do have some time allowed to us by STRGBA to put this all of these details of the plans into effect. So one of the things that STRGBA allows is for an interim milestone to be incorporated into the plan. And that interim milestone allows you to actually exceed the minimum thresholds with your water levels during some time period that you designate, if needed, while you get your projects and management actions in place. STRGBA and the legislature certainly understood that there was no way that you could arrive at January 31st, 2022 and bingo, you have all of your projects in place. Nobody expected that to be able to be possible. And in some cases, these projects will need several years to be developed, engineering, permitting, CEQA. So there are several stopgaps, I'll call them, in place within the regulations that keep you out of being in probation the very first year. Certainly the technical team doesn't want to set you up for failure, and we're trying really hard to balance the need for maintaining conditions with respect to interconnected surface water, conditions with respect to domestic wells and other water supply wells in the basin. We're trying to balance those needs against the need to continue to decline and the need to be able to have time to get the projects going forward. So that balance is allowed through an interim milestone process, and we're going to be looking at that carefully as soon as we get the monitoring networks together for the GSP. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, thanks, Phyllis. And I completely understand why this year's data is not included in the report. That's you guys are doing a great job, and I just was curious because I've heard of other areas of the state having issues with wells going dry. So I was just curious what's been going on in your sub-basin, and that sounds like you guys are actually in good shape, which is fantastic.
We hope so. Any other questions? And while I'm waiting to see if there are any other questions, I'll just put the last slide to finish up. So obviously these next steps involve groundwater storage, land subsidence, and water quality. Those sustainability indicators are being put together. to me, they are less water level specific. I don't mean to, I don't know quite how to say that. That's not exactly right. But the chronic lowering of water levels in the interconnected surface water seem to be the hardest to balance with respect to conditions and considerations in the subbasin. So I think that even though you're saying, wow, it took this long to get those first two and we still got 3 to go, they feel to me, at least for the technical team, to be a little bit more straightforward. And we will begin that process at the next, we're going to ask for another special meeting in July, and we'll begin that process of going through those sustainability indicators and how we view potential sustainable management criteria in the special meeting at the end of this month. We will immediately, upon an okay from the GSAs, begin revising and finalizing a monitoring network such that we can get MPs, MOs, and the interim milestones that I talked about with respect to representative monitoring wells in place, and get that back in front of everyone for your review. And then in parallel, we are continuing. This is not the only thing happening. The technical team is focused very much on development and analysis of projects and management actions. They are in the throes of the engineering feasibility details right now. So we are planning to analyze those to the extent that we can to show how that benefits the subbasin, and develop those final numbers for everyone's review in the final draft of the GSP, which is coming up. So we are scrambling to get everything done as well as we possibly can in the time remaining. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. Here again, I'm not seeing any hands up. Member agencies, anything left to comment, question on with this presentation, applicable to this presentation? Okay, members of the public. Okay, hearing none, seeing no hands, we're going to move on to item 5, which is the next meeting. And that was a good segue to that. We've got a lot of business to address. So we'd like to actually have a special meeting, and there's a correction on the agenda there. So the next meeting we are proposing to actually have, instead of before our regularly scheduled STRGBA GSA meeting, we're planning to have it here in a couple weeks on July 28th from 2 to 4 p.m. July 28th, 2 to 4, and that will just be a TAC meeting. So any comments or questions on that from the member agencies? Hearing none, seeing none. Questions, comments from the public? Okay, let's move on to item number 6. Are there any items too late for the agenda? Member agencies. Very good. Public, anything from the public? All right. So the time is now 2:44 p.m. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the TAC meeting.
Motion to adjourn the TAC meeting.
Thanks, Chad. Second? You're muted, Walt.
Second.
Thanks, Walt. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, meeting adjourned, rather. Okay, with that, and time now being 2:45 p.m. and being respectful of everybody's time, I'd like to call the July 14th, 2021 STRGBA GSA meeting to order. So the member agencies on the phone again. We've got Mike Pickock from City of Waterford. We got myself, Eric Thorburn, Oakdale Irrigation District, Chad Takins on the phone from Modesto Irrigation District, and Walt Ward from Stanislaus County. Did I miss anybody? Okay, well, we have a quorum, so let's move right into item number 2, which is business from the public. So at this time, interested persons are welcome to introduce any topic within the agency's jurisdiction. Matters presented under this heading be discussed, but no action will be taken by the agent at this meeting. So I'm going to open it up to the public there. Seeing no hands raised, we will move on to item number 3. So this is approval of the June 9th, 2021 STRGBA GSA meeting minutes. And I'll entertain a meeting, assuming everybody's had a chance to look over those meeting minutes.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Thanks, Chad.
Second, Waterford.
Thanks, Mike. Are there any comments or questions from the member agencies with that? Hearing none. Questions or comments from the public? Seeing no hands raised, we'll proceed to a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 4. The topic here is the chronic lowering of groundwater levels and the resolution. Therefore, Gordon, I think this was, you were going to take the lead on this, right?
That's correct. I think we had the budget and schedule update first, or did I get pushed back? Oh, I'm sorry. That's on the next item. Okay.
That's number 6. We're on number 4.
Right.
So yeah, 2 more.
Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Eric and Phyllis mentioned during the TAC meeting, we wanted to propose a draft definition for the GSA to consider and approve at today's meeting. So included in today's handouts are draft definitions of undesirable results and minimum thresholds for 2 sustainability indicators, chronic lowering of water levels and interconnected surface water. And these definitions would apply to the Modesto subbasin and are required by SGMA. So staff recommends that the STRGBA GSA make the determination that undesirable results for the chronic lowering of groundwater levels are defined as the chronic lowering of groundwater levels in the Modesto subbasin that produce significant and unreasonable groundwater level declines, either due to multi-year droughts or due to chronic declines where groundwater is the sole supply, such that water supply levels are adversely impacted in a manner that cannot be readily managed or mitigated. And staff also recommends that the GSA further determine that the minimum threshold will be expressed as the historic low groundwater elevation observed or estimated from water year 1999 through 2020 at each representative monitoring location based on available data. Undesirable results will be evidenced by an exceedance of a minimum threshold in a designated percentage of representative monitoring wells for a number of consecutive semi-annual monitoring events in each management area. So we'd like to entertain it, or we'd like to make that the motion that the GSA consider.
Eric, you're on mute.
We'll entertain a motion. Thanks, Walt.
I'll make that motion for approval.
Per the
I'll sec-
recommended action on the agenda, correct, Walt?
Yes,
Thank you.
And I'll second.
as Gordon just described.
Perfect. Okay, I've got a motion and a second. Let's open up to the public for more member agencies. First, let's go to the member agencies first. Comments, questions from the member agencies? Okay, let's open it up for comments or questions from the public. Dennis, you've got your hand raised. You've got the floor, Dennis.
Yep. Okay. I think I'm unmuted now.
Yep, we can hear you.
So if I understand correctly, the number of wells or percentage of wells and number of consecutive testing, that's all to be determined yet?
Right.
That is correct.
And when will that be determined?
Well, it'll play out. I would assume we're going to be having that play out in the next month. But tune in the next 2 weeks and we'll be talking about it at the next TAC meeting. Action would not be taken until the next GSA meeting, which is next month. So that's the soonest action would be taken on that.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Any other comments or questions from the public? Okay, seeing none, let's proceed with a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 5. This is the interconnected surface water resolution. I think you touched on this, Gordon. Did you have more on this?
Yeah, and again, I apologize for the wordiness. I just want to read the recommendation from the staff for the GSA to consider. And with regard to interconnected surface water, the staff recommends that the STRGBA GSA make the determination that unreasonable results for interconnected surface water in the Modesto subbasin occur when significant and unreasonable adverse impacts to the beneficial uses of surface water are caused by groundwater extraction. Staff also recommends that the GSA further determine that for the Tuolumne, San Joaquin, and Stanislaus rivers, the minimum threshold will be expressed as the low groundwater elevations observed in the fall of 2015 at representative monitoring well locations along the river boundaries. Undesirable results will be evidenced by an exceedance of a minimum threshold at a designated percentage of representative monitoring locations for a designated number of consecutive semi-annual monitoring events along each river. And that's the recommendation that we would like to get approved at today's meeting.
Thanks, Gordon. So I will entertain a motion.
Yeah, I move to approve the resolution as presented in the agenda.
Thank you, Chad.
I'll second.
Thanks, Walt.
Mhm.
We'll open it up for questions or comments from the member agencies. Okay, we'll now open it up to the public. Comments or questions from the public? Okay, seeing no hands raised, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to item 6, which is the budget and schedule. An update on that. That's you, Gordon, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah. Again, the updated budget and expense chart was included on today's handouts. And as of May 31st, the TOD groundwater consultant team has expended 61% of the budget and 83% of the schedule. And that's all I have on the budget.
Thank you.
Hey, Gordon, I just had a follow-up question on that in regards to the pay in arrears, the payback by this DWR. Have they been coming through on that? And have there been any glitches? I know they hold 10% that we're supposed to get back at the end. But other than that, are things going smoothly on the contract?
Well, I think they are, Walt. Actually, you know, City of Modesto is the contract holder, and I don't,
yeah.
and I don't
Okay.
always get the payment status from them. So, and unfortunately, I don't think Miguel is on the call today.
Okay, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
But I could ask him and follow up at our next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any other comments, questions from member agencies? Okay, let's open it up to the public. Comments, questions on the GSP budget and schedule? I don't see any hands raised here. So we'll move on to item number 7, which is the next Stanislaus and Tuolumne Rivers Groundwater Basin Association Groundwater Sustainability Agency meeting, which is proposed to be the 11th of August. And that's currently proposed to be 1:30 p.m. Comments or questions on that, the next meeting from the member agencies? Comments, questions from the public? Okay, thank you. Item number 8, are there any items too late for the agenda? Again, go to the member agencies first. Anything from the public? All right, we're going to end an hour early, essentially. So the time is now 2:58. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Thanks, Chad.
Second.
Second by Mike. Thank you, Mike. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes and meeting adjourned. See you in a couple weeks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
everybody who
everyone.
participated.